Go. So today we are on the lectionary lessons that are appointed for the Sunday closest to October 26th, which is in 2 days, the day itself. And so that makes us on proper 25 in the Revised Common Lectionary. And we are in year B still. And St. Luke's is following track 2 of the lessons, which is sometimes called the complementary readings, because the first lesson is determined by the gospel lesson. It's more in the more traditional form of the older lectionary. So we'll start with that today because it's just a beautiful passage actually from Jeremiah. Jeremiah, which is usually quite negative. Hence we get the term a Jeremiad, if you've ever heard that term, which is usually someone who is speaking publicly and has a screed, a very negative screed against something. And in literature, that's often called a Jeremiad because Jeremiah just is one of those kind of prophets. He's constantly complaining against the people of Israel, as prophets tend to do. But today is a comforting reading, as also happens, but we don't often hear those. We don't hear those words very often in that context of comfort. So I'm going to do a quick screen share while we look at Jeremiah, just to kind of give us some comfort. So we should be looking at that. You see Jeremiah 31 on your screen. Thus says the Lord, sing aloud with gladness for Jacob, and raise shouts for the chief of the nations. Proclaim, give praise, and say, save, O Lord, your people, the remnant of Israel. See, I am going to bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the farthest parts of the earth. Among them the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor together, a great company, they shall return here. With weeping they shall come, and with consolations I will lead them back. I will let them walk by brooks of water in a straight path in which they shall not stumble. For I have become a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Now, the reason I say that these are comforting words in Jeremiah is because Jeremiah is the prophet of the exile. He is at the beginning of his work. He is the one who is told by God to buy a piece of property, take the deed and put it in a pot and bury it because the people are being exiled out of Israel. This is the Babylonian exile we're talking about, I believe. So the people are actually leaving the land. And so the idea behind that symbol was that God will bring them back, that this is but a temporary sort of chastisement or punishment for the failure of Israel to follow the Torah. And this is the yin and yang of the prophets all through the Old Testament, where there is this sort of this judgment of God on the nation of Israel because of its lack of fidelity to the covenant. And then always God relents and God repents of what he has done, very much like the story of the flood, and then brings Israel home. So this is that sort of element of that prophecy where Jeremiah is saying, shout for joy and for gladness, because essentially the Lord is restoring you to your homeland, or will restore you to your homeland. But it's interesting that here, and we also have heard it from the words of Isaiah, that this idea of blindness, and where the blind shall see, the lame shall walk or leap sometimes, leap for joy. There's this notion of restoration, of being made whole again. So that even when we are at our healing mass, our healing service on Wednesdays, That is a continual theme through the liturgy and through even our Christian healing services, that there may be a cure for sickness and disease, but healing is a larger concept. Healing is about restoration. It is about making whole again that which has been broken. So when we look at it from a point of view of our physical bodies, whenever we suffer some sort of malady like blindness or deafness, or people become mute, or they become lame for whatever reason, that the healing is very often the first portion of that healing is a restoration of bodily function, but that's not the whole of healing. The healing follows after that. And so I want to just say that, because when we read the passage from Mark, we're going to try to flesh that out a little bit. So let's go there now. Let's go to Mark, and then we'll come back to this notion and see how it has an impact on us. There we go. The gospel lesson this week is a continuation of the Gospel of Mark. We are in the 10th chapter, and we start at the 46th verse. Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and to say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Now, Menli sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and he said, "Call him over here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Here ends the lesson. So, what strikes you as we read this particular lesson?
Well, we've heard this kind of before, where people who Jesus has never seen before come to him in distress and want to be healed, and they believe in him and show that they have unquestioning faith in him.
Mm-hmm.
And he responds to that.
I'm just adjusting my sound here. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Should I drone on?
No, quite the opposite. I'm not making it quieter, George, making it louder. But you're right. It follows a pattern, and that's a very important thing to realize for our interpretation, that it follows a pattern of healing miracles all through the Gospel of Mark and through the other Gospels as well. But there's a reason for that too, and it may be just a little sidebar we could do here. And we haven't talked, as I recall, in our studies too much about the more technical dimensions of exegesis or interpretation of the text. And one of the things as Bible students, need to come to an awareness of is that the four canonical gospels, the four that were chosen by the church as authentic and inspired scripture, are divided into two portions. We have mentioned this a little bit. One portion are called the synoptic gospels, and then John, the Gospel of John, is off by itself. So we have the three that are called synoptic. And by that term, it's just simply a word which is a compound Greek term, which means from syn, S-Y-N, which means together, and optic, which means seen or from the eye. And so when we call them synoptic, what we mean is we see them together. And the reason we do that is are some theories, nobody knows this for certain, so they remain theories, that Mark, we have from the textual evidence, is the earliest gospel, and that this, as these theories go, more than likely, Matthew and Luke used material from the Gospel of Mark in the composition of their respective Gospels. Now, I don't have it available to me. It got lost in the annals of time somehow. I couldn't, or somebody borrowed it and never returned it at one point. I don't know. But there is a standard text that we used in first year seminary. So this goes back, longer than I want to count. The editor's name is Throckmorton. So if you hear somebody talk about the Throckmorton, that's exactly what they're talking about, is this theory. Because what Throckmorton did in this particular text is he has in the book 3 columns. And, well, actually 4. And the 3 columns are the 3 gospels of the synoptics. And what he does is he outlines material that is shared by all 3, material that is shared by only 2, and material that is unique to each gospel. And you would see that most of the gospels share a lot of material. There's very little unique in each of the 3 gospels, and an overwhelming amount of material from the Gospel of Mark is duplicated in Matthew and Luke, although often in different kinds of stories and in different contexts. And so basically what we have are 3 gospels, each with their own theological bias, with their own community who is receiving them. And so the author of the gospel is writing it in such a way as to communicate meaning effectively to the communities to which they are writing or for which they are writing, and preserving these gospel stories. And so we have those 3. And there is material, for example, however, that is in Matthew and Luke together, but not in Mark. And so these theorists come up with yet another source, which is euphemistically called Q.
You.
But the word, it's only called Q because it comes from these are all German scholars, from the word Quelle. And Quelle is just a German word that means source. So it's no fancy, special code or anything. It's just that it's easier to write the letter Q than to write out Quelle all the time. So we have, in terms of source theory for the 3 synoptic gospels, we have we have Mark and Q as the fundamental sources, and then some minor sort of, you almost say, poetic license source that is used by Matthew and Luke. Because, for example, when you look at the Christmas stories, I mean, this is really very evident when you get to Christmas. Because, when we tell the Christmas story at home, or we use a creche or something like that, we conflate a lot of stuff into one story, which is actually 2 distinct stories. Matthew's infancy narrative differs from Luke's infancy narrative, and there is no infancy narrative in Mark. When we open Mark's gospel, Jesus pops out of the wilderness. He's proclaiming the kingdom. So there is no precursor to that, where in Matthew we have the Genesis story, the Genesis of Jesus, in the sense of the genealogies. In each of those gospels, there's a genealogy, although they differ from one another. And there are the prototypical story, or the proto stories that we get, like, for example, the shepherds, the Christmas night story. Oh, there were shepherds abiding in the field, et cetera, et cetera. That's in Luke, but not in Matthew. There are no shepherds in Matthew. In Matthew, we get the Epiphany, we get the Magi coming. And so that's really the uh, thing that we have to be mindful of, is that when we read these various stories, there is unique material to each of them, some of which they share with one another, and some of which they simply hijack from Mark. So now bring it full circle. We'll come back to the main point. And so when we see these healing stories, they often follow this pattern. And so the pattern is usually a request, a recognition or acknowledgement by Jesus. Jesus very often will ask a question, and then, depending upon the response to the question, will grant the request of the person seeking the healing. So these healing stories have this marvelous pattern to them. And there's a great book, if you're ever interested in pursuing this, by William Barclay, who you've heard me talk about him many times, a Scottish scripture scholar that's grew very old in human years and then went on to God several years ago. But it's a compendium of his commentaries on the healing stories, and it's called "And He Had Compassion" by William C. Barclay. And it's a marvelous sort of collection of essays on these various healing stories. And the thing that Barclay does, interestingly, is he has this essential approach to these healing miracles. He said, perhaps we can, with our modern eyes and understanding, explain how this cure might have come about. This goes back to our original point here. However, it does not, while it can explain the physical dimensions of it, it does not explain the miraculous nature of it from several different points of view. For example, with 21st century eyes, we could say, oh yeah, well, that happened because, and yet this is Jesus, and stories being told about actions being taken in what we call the first century of the Common Era. That knowledge would not have been common knowledge, although there may have been some folk medicine, what we would call folk medicine or current medicine, indigenous medicines and those kinds of things, which Jesus may have been aware of and then simply applied. But there's always the larger question, and that's what we want to focus on a little bit here. What is this larger issue? So thank you for that, George. I think, that launched me into that sort of sidebar, but I think it's important. Those are important things to kind of keep in mind that when we hear these stories and we see them, so we don't get wrapped up so much in the cure element of it, because that's where a lot of people go with this, particularly if they're suffering from a malady that is similar or perhaps even the same as one of the characters in the gospel, but it's included in the gospel for a larger purpose. And so we have to go and we look for that larger purpose. So here we have a couple of things I want to point out. Bartimaeus It's interesting. That's his name, Bartimaeus, and all it means is son of Timaeus, because Bar is a Semitic way of like um, in Scottish or Scotch Irish, Fitz something, Fitzgerald. All that means it's the son of Gerald or the family of Gerald. Or in Scandinavian terminology, Davidson means the son of David, or Danielson, the son of Daniel. Or we have in German colloquial, nomenclature, we have the word von, V-O-N, which often means simply of the house of, and then whatever the surname is. And that's what bar means. Whenever you see bar in front of a name, it means the son of, or a descendant of, or a member of the family of. So in this case, Bartimaeus is not a unique name. It simply means, as it's there almost as an appositive, the son of Timaeus. But what's interesting there is the real appositive for that name is a blind beggar. Now, why would it be a blind beggar?
Well, a blind beggar is missing the most important aspect of his senses that would make him understand Jesus more easily, like the rest of us. But in
Perhaps.
this case, there is a huge impediment. So a person who would have faith while blind, and hence the comment is blind faith, uh,
Yeah, yeah.
comes from this concept that that's an uncommon kind of faith, much deeper than the one that all of us with our capacities uh, have it with ease, but not this person.
Hmm. And I would put a pin in that for a moment because we'll come back to that. And yet there's even more to this phrase than that. Because our attention, interestingly, as you just did, George, goes immediately to the word blind. The important word here is beggar. Why is he a beggar?
There's no way that he can have an occupation.
Because he's blind.
Yeah.
See, so that's why it's an interesting use here of this appositive, that, he is a blind beggar. Why is he a beggar? Because he's blind. So there's no other way for him to sustain himself but to quote Blanche Dubois from A Streetcar Named Desire, he has to depend on the kindness of strangers. And so his identity as a beggar is one of the key things here, almost more so than being blind for the moment. As I said, put a pin in what you just said about faith and so on, because we're going to come back to that, because it is very important. But in terms of introducing the story and introducing the characters and the dynamic between the conversation with Jesus and this man, so that when we get to the portion of the gospel where where Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" He says, "My teacher, let me see again." What is he really asking for?
He's asking
Let
for
me
his self
see
dignity
you.
back and
Say again?
work.
I missed what you said, Kathy. I'm sorry.
He's asking for self dignity back to be able to work and support himself.
Actually, even, that's a very American point of view, to self-dignity and support yourself. It's, which is true. But more so even than that, he wants to be restored to his community.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to have, again, like as I just said, to, quote Blanche Dubois, depend on the kindness of strangers. He wants this sense of self-determination and agency. But more importantly, too, he's always at the margins because he's not a contributing member of society. Notice where he is. He's on a roadside outside the town. You see, because people who had these maladies, again, we have to go back to the Old Testament view on this stuff, that these kinds of things were often perceived not as simply illness or disease or misfortune, say if you had an accident or something, but rather as exactly a punishment for sin. So that somehow he is castigated and cast to the side. So he is an outcast, even if he's not an outcast in the same degree, say, as a leper or someone like that, but rather is put to the margins of society and depends upon the kindness of strangers. Now, that kindness of strangers is not a flip phrase in this context, because actually that is a demand of the Torah. But the Torah does not demand that you keep people in the community or keep them as part of your family or any of those kinds of things. You just have to make sure that they have enough. And so when a beggar begs, it is a responsibility under the Torah that if you have something, you must share it with them. That is a prescription of the Torah. So it's what's called a mitzvah. It's a good work. And so you see a beggar, you give them something. George, you're smiling.
Well, it reminds me of Fiddler on the Roof. And there's a beggar in town, and everybody knows him. And one of his reliable contributors says, "Well, I don't really have so much today, so I can't give you much." And he said, "Well, is that a good reason? Did I have to suffer?"
Exactly. Yes. There you go. That is very much a part of that ethos, you see. So there is still a responsibility of the community to care for those who are, we might say in this kind of terminology, less fortunate or who have come upon hard times and so on. But it's a sort of, it's not quite the same as we would think of like in today's world, in our culture, in our society, the very fact that we have ADA legislation. We want people to be quote unquote mainstreamed into the society. That's exactly the opposite in this society, that people were not mainstreamed. They were pushed to the margins, pushed to the edge. Accommodation was not made for them, except that they were not to starve. They were not to starve. And so what begging in that sense was, on one view, about the only noble thing that a person like this could do to sustain themselves, because it was permitted under the Torah to beg. And therefore, and then I shouldn't say therefore, but part of the responsibility of the community was, as you passed the beggar, then you were to give them something. Just as a little sideline, I don't know if you're familiar with the humor of the Monty Python corps of comedians, but in one of their skits, I think it might be even in The Life of Brian, I don't really recall, but there's a beggar, and one of the apostles or Jesus or somebody, I don't really remember, heals the beggar of whatever malady they had. They said, "What did you go and do that for? Now I have to go to work." But again, because it's part of this ethos is what I'm saying, you see. So, but it isn't, it's the kind of thing that I have preached on from time to time. When we sometimes pass people who are asking for handouts, we sort of a guilt thing. We don't want to give them something. Usually the answer is, I don't want to give them something because they're going to use it to buy cigarettes or alcohol or something. Well, that removes any agency from them, first of all. Secondly, what it does do is when we ignore them, we treat them like they do not exist. And actually, if you ever have worked in ministry with homeless folk, say, in food distribution or something like that, that often, if you get into a deep conversation with them, which you certainly can from time to time, they say it hurts more to be ignored than to have somebody say no. It would be better to say, not today, or I don't have anything, or I'm sorry, but I can't help you today, rather than simply keep walking as if they don't exist. And that I've taken to heart. I learned that a very, very long time ago, and I've taken that to heart, that I at least acknowledge people. Even, we have this phenomenon, and yes, it is sort of a scam in a lot of ways. The people on the intersections with the little sign and all that sort of thing. Often what's happening is they're actually being paid to do that. They are themselves beggars, but they're being paid to do that. They turn in the money, they get a certain part of it, and then someone else takes the money. So they're
Oh,
being,
that's horrible.
yeah, well, they're being abused by that,
Yeah.
but it's the only way they feel that they can get any kind of money. And so, whether you want to contribute to that cycle or not is an independent decision. But when someone is clearly not doing that sort of thing, or trying to guilt you into it, guilting into it is not good either. I'm homeless. I'm a veteran, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But don't try to capitalize, we can go into a whole discussion about that, but I want to get out of that rabbit hole. But this idea of being a beggar and the identity of beggars were quite frequent for obvious reasons. If they were marginalized, if they were pushed to the edge of society, if they could not be seen as productive or contributing members to the community, they were pushed to the edge, and often were at the gates of the city, or at the gates of the temple, or on a roadside like Bartimaeus was. So all packed into that little phrase there, we have a whole sort of mindset that we have to think about as Jesus and the disciples are leaving Jericho, and they see this blind beggar sitting by the roadside. But being blind, he doesn't know what's going on, and there's maybe there's this group passing by, or maybe Jesus is leaving Jericho, so maybe there's some people saying, "Oh, wasn't that guy great? Wasn't he a great preacher?" Or whatever. And so he's hearing this again. We often know or often think that people who have lost one sensate faculty often develop more keen senses in other areas. So maybe he can overhear conversations, or has learned how to listen to conversations and so on of passersby to figure out what's going on, because he can't see it for himself. So
Well,
he
in this
hears,
passage, there was a person that told him
mm,
that Jesus was passing by.
yes. Well, it could have been saying, "What's going on?" That kind of thing. Or because it says it when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, he had heard of Jesus before.
Yeah.
So he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, there's another phrase there that's worth our attention. Son of David. There's a whole raft of stuff with that. Now, we right away say, well, that's because Jesus was the Messiah. He was the appointed one to sit on the throne of David. We know that from the Christmas stories and so on. But why is this title somewhat significant in the context of this particular story?
Well, we're told that he was a direct descendant of the line of David,
Mm-hmm.
the greatest of their kings,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's a sign of his uh, authority that he has inherited that made him so special.
But what makes him special in this context? See, there's some unwritten, unspoken stuff here that
Yeah.
sometimes we don't advert to because it's not our experience.
Yeah. Well, I would guess it's part of the thing that for those to whom much has been given, much is expected.
Partly.
And that if you are the line of David, much is expected of you.
Mhm. Even further than that. It has to do with being the son of the king,
Yeah.
which makes you the next in line. Kings are anointed. Why are kings anointed? Like, that's one of the distinctions, interestingly, of the monarchy in England. Most of the other European monarchies do not anoint their monarchs. But this is an unbroken tradition that goes all the way back to the, early Middle Ages.
Well, healing oil?
You're
Well,
somewhat close. It's not actually healing oil, it's chrism that anoints them.
Chrism, yeah, it's chrism, but
I mean, we're going
power
all
of
the
the-
way back to Samuel.
Yeah. Pour the
And
oil on David's head.
yeah,
Yeah.
But
and
why?
who
That, I
chose
mean,
him.
that's that wonderful piece by Handel, Zadok, the priest, and Nathan, the prophet, anointed David, and so on.
Yeah.
But why would this, now remember the context of the story. This is a healing story. Kings were anointed because they also, in the anointing, became priests.
Oh,
Okay.
And kings, anointed monarchs, often were thought to have healing powers. In fact, there's an interesting, if you, again, to go back to popular culture, if you watched the Netflix series, The Tudors, at the very end of the series, the Duke of Suffolk is very sick. And he is one of Henry's closest friends and confidants. And Henry himself is in his last days. And so he summons the Duke of Suffolk to come and see him. So, of course, he has to come to the king, not the other way around. And so Suffolk, gets himself to Hampton Court or wherever Henry was at the time, and sort of is dying, really. And Henry, in his sort of in some ways his hubris, but in other ways thoroughly consistent with this tradition, goes to Suffolk and basically tells him to kneel, and he imposes hands on his head and invokes healing powers because he wants to save his friend. Because of this tradition, that the king has healing powers. So we often think of kings merely as for secular powers, but in the biblical line, in the biblical tradition, anointed kings have spiritual powers as well. We see this manifest in Solomon in his wisdom and so on. But it wasn't uncommon for people who were suffering from maladies of one sort or another to seek healing from the king. And what else, given what we just said about marginalization and everything, could the king have the power to do?
Restore them to community.
Restore them. I mean, if the king said, give him a house, they had to give him a house, that sort of thing. So there is this sense of regal power that is acknowledged by Bartimaeus. Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Now, you've heard me preach about this before, this notion of mercy. When we say Kyrie eleison during the liturgy, even when the liturgy was in Latin, that's Greek, that phrase, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, because there's no adequate translation. We translate it into English, Lord, have mercy. But the word eleison itself is more about the pouring out of the king's grace or largesse, if you will. And the phrase developed over time when the king would do visitation in the ancient world, and he would distribute gifts as they made their progress through the countryside. And the simplest way of thinking about it is they had a bag of coins and they'd be on their horse or whatever and just throwing it out at the people. The Maundy Thursday tradition in Britain is part of that, where the monarch on Maundy Thursday goes out and actually gives gifts of like a sovereign, which in the day was a lot of money. And to whom would they give it? To the poor. They would visit the poor and actually press a sovereign into their hands. So that this notion of Son of David, the king, have mercy, eleison, pour out your grace upon me. So there's a richness and a depth to this that we can often miss just because we don't speak the language. So, so it's Jesus, Son of David, pour out your blessing on me. Let it ooze, because the roots of the word eleison are like the same thing. We'll go back to this notion of oil again. The anointed one is now pouring out the oil onto others, that it just kind of seeps into you, into your cells. I mean, that's why chrism is such a powerful symbol, and why we reserve it for only certain very special moments in the church, because it's perfumed oil. And once you put it on something, like when in the Roman Rite, my hands were anointed with chrism, and the bishop was a firm believer in sacramental signs. I mean, he slathered it on my hands. I mean, and so for the rest of the day, you could smell the, what is it that they put in it? I can't think of what the essential
Rosemary balsam.
balsam. That's it, balsam. Thank you. You could smell the balsam, even though my hands had been cleaned with lemons and things to take the oil off. But I mean, because it's in your flesh. So it's that kind of blessing that is being asked for here. And whenever we say that term, Lord, have mercy, and we say it in the spirit of Kyrie eleison, that's what we're asking for. That's what we're asking for. It isn't the sort of confiteor miserere, beat my breast kind of, oh, have mercy upon me, a sinner, in the sense where we're asking for forgiveness and a removal of judgment. What we are asking for is beyond that. It's more. It's the very essence of God to come into us, into our very spirits, minds, bodies, into our fleshly existence.
Before the day of antibiotic ointments, one of the things that was very fundamental in dealing with wounds that didn't heal was to use balsam of Peru.
Ah.
It was a very nice smelling oily substance, and we used it frequently during my residency.
Really? That recently? Okay.
Before we had antibiotics.
Wow. Wow. And to think of, actually, I have a little problem with my feet, and it's gross. I won't talk about it. But one of the things my doctor has recommended is that I use an oil with tea tree oil in it.
Oh, I have it in my cabinet.
There you go. And actually, there's cloves and there's a few other things. And actually, it's a quite nice smelling thing. I kind of like it just for itself, but it has some healing properties for this issue that I have. And it's, he said, there are medications for this and all, but, their effectiveness is not all that it's cracked up to be. The pharmaceutical companies want you to buy them, of course. but he said this is just as effective. It takes maybe a little longer because it's a natural healing process. So, but he says as long as you're disciplined about putting it on, in the morning and in the evening, and maybe if your feet are bare during the day, whenever you think about it, put it on. That there you go. I mean, that's a wonderful example, George, of this notion of that's a perfect metaphor, this notion of Kyrie eleison. The other thing, the pleasant aroma, of course, with infected wounds, infections usually stink a little bit. And
Yes.
so it also covers over that. And in that sense, when people had infections, that's one reason people would avoid them. I mean, we avoid people who smell bad. It's just that simple. And so that's the advent of the whole concept of parfum in continental culture, was because it took care of, body odor when we didn't really know where body odor came from. And, you would just douse yourself with this nice smelling stuff. Which I was told once, I don't know exactly the chemical composition and I never bothered to research it, but I was once told that Chanel, which is one of the most expensive perfumes available and one of the nicest, is actually skunk oil. But skunk oil smells so awful because it's so intense. And what this is extremely diluted. At least I was told that's the origin of it. Now it's not probably skunk oil anymore, but that was the origin of it back in the day.
I have to ask my brother-in-law about that.
Okay.
Well,
I'd like to
actually,
know,
no. Well, his family company is Citrus and Allied, and they don't often to always make perfumes, but he makes a lot of food additives or food things. But they also are in alliance with these perfume makers.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets I've gotten some very interesting perfumes over the years.
Yeah, I imagine. When they say hints of citrus and hits of
Yeah,
hibiscus, and I can never smell all that stuff. They say that about
about wine too.
wines, and I love wine, but I've never been disciplined enough to take a course where they force you to, say what you're smelling and all that kind of stuff. I just drink it. So
Every now and then I can smell a few things or taste a little, like pepper and Cabernet Franc or something
or
like
yeah,
that. But
those kinds of things.
or grapefruit and Sauvignon Blanc. But
Yeah, the overwhelming part of
yeah,
it, but when it can hints of something, I'm clueless. I can't let it go long enough without swilling it down, that I just, So anyway, but getting back to the text here, this notion of this phrase, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, is extraordinarily powerful and deep. And so this recognition by this blind beggar, already a deep concept, as we talked about it, that he hears that it's Jesus of Nazareth. And he has come to the conclusion that this Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of David and has the powers of the king. So it's not simply a recognition of a legal title or an identity from on that seemingly superficial level, but rather that Jesus is the anointed one. And what does the word Christos mean in Greek?
Well, I guess from Christ.
Well, no,
No.
Christos is the word Christ. But
Yeah.
where does it come from? It comes from chrism,
Oh,
oil.
the anointed one. That's what the word Christ means. When we say Jesus Christ, it isn't his surname. It's, it's interesting when people want to swear, they go, Jesus H. Christ. It's like, and there's a reason why that came about. But this notion of the word Christ itself is an appellation. It is a name that is applied to Jesus of Nazareth because he is seen as the anointed one, the chosen one, the Messiah, the Son of David. We can go on with all the titles and all that sort of thing. but that's where it comes from. So when he says, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, he's essentially calling him the Christ, the anointed one, who has been anointed, has had the oil poured on him, and now I want you to pour that out on me. So that's where that goes. So this, we just got like through 1.5 verses here, and or maybe 2. They're not numbered in this text, but it's an amazingly deep reality here. So the next phrase, many sternly ordered him to be quiet. Again, because he's at the margins. He has no right to call out to this privileged one, to the anointed one. But he called out all the more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. Didn't even use Jesus' proper name. Just simply calls him by his title. And then, so let's ferret that out a little bit. Just as I mentioned, the crowd around is saying, you're just a blind beggar. Go over there. Shut up. Keep quiet. You have no right to do this. Again, because of his status in society. But he says, I don't care. In street language, he'd say, I don't give a damn. I want to see Jesus. So Jesus acknowledges this. The text says Jesus stood still. So apparently Jesus is walking this whole time when this commotion is going on. So it says Jesus stood still and said, call him here. Bring him to me. Just as I sort of talked about Henry and Suffolk in the story of the Tudors, he is summoned. Bartimaeus is summoned to Jesus' presence. And so they called the blind man and saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. So all of a sudden their tone changes because now Jesus has acknowledged him. And so he's no longer just the blind man over there. There must be something going on. So, and the presumption is the crowd around Jesus are his disciples. And this is where it's going to lead us to go back to what you said at the outset, George. So that's why I said, put a pin in that. Because now we come up and they say, take heart, get up. He's calling you. Now they're saying, oh, okay. You're desperate. You seem to be very desperate. Jesus has acknowledged you. So we're going to get you over there. But he said, then Mark says, so throwing off his cloak. Why is that significant?
I was wondering that also. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe he wants his whole body to be exposed to Jesus rather than covering it up.
Well, he would still have clothes on because cloak
Yeah,
is his overcoat, as it were. But think about it for a moment. What was the importance of a cloak in this day and age? Have you ever seen me in my capa negra? That big black cape that I wear when we go to cemeteries or I'm outside in the cold when I have a cassock on? What does a cloak do?
Well, it keeps you warm and protects you.
The latter part of that, yeah, keep you warm is one very important part. That's a very practical thing, but it's your protection. It's your protection from a lot of things. It's your protection from the elements. It keeps you warm, but it also keeps you dry in the rain. It also shields your body if someone tries to attack you. It's harder to get through a cloak than it is if you are exposed. So what is happening here? He is making himself what?
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable. Exactly. Perfect word. He throws off his cloak. He says, I don't need this protection. I'm being brought to the anointed one. So when we start talking about discipleship, do we go to Jesus fully cloaked, or are we willing to throw off our cloak and to be vulnerable in front of Jesus? Because the man does not know what Jesus is going to do yet. It may also be, as again, cloaks were used to hide what?
Or you could have knives or
Weapons,
weapons.
right?
Yeah.
I have no weapons. I have no defense. I am defenseless. Again, that just emphasizes the vulnerability. He throws off his cloak. That's, there's a story in Christian hagiography of Martin of Tours. It's a very ancient story. It goes back to the early days of Christianity, where Martin, who was a knight, or a soldier, rather, I should say a soldier, encounters a beggar along the way. And Martin is a Christian. And so he encounters the beggar, and he takes his cloak and he takes his sword and he cuts it in half. And he gives the half of the cloak to the beggar. For a soldier to do that exposes him, makes him more vulnerable than he was before, but also in the process of doing that shields another. So this notion of the cloak, again, it's not just it's encumbering and he can't get there fast enough because it's heavy or whatever, whatever we could come up with. There's a symbolism here, again, that makes this story exceedingly rich, that the beggar throws off his cloak. The fact that he has one is important. Most beggars would, because they didn't live anywhere. They lived in the elements. They were street people. So having a cloak was essentially important. And he just throws it off. He doesn't hand it to somebody and say, here, keep this for me, I'll be back. He just throws, somebody could have walked away with it. Really, when you stop to think about all the implications of what this is, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. Doesn't say he was led to Jesus. He came to Jesus. So whether he was, we could, from a practical point of view, because was he honing in on Jesus' voice with his hearing? Was he that skilled, at, negotiating the world as a blind person, that sort of thing. But regardless, he comes to Jesus totally defenseless, totally vulnerable. And Jesus then asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, my teacher, let me see again. Let me see again.
Did he say again, or did?
No,
Yes,
it's in the text. Let me see
okay.
again. So he would have been someone who knew what it meant to be able to see.
Yeah.
And lost his sight through maybe disease or some other unfortunate accident. But he says, let me see again. Which is reminiscent to me of a similar scene in John's gospel. Now, I went through the whole thing with the synoptics, but here we go. We have a healing, and this is usually read during Lent, where Jesus heals the man born blind, if you recall that story.
Yeah.
And Jesus does the same thing. Here's that pattern, though. See, what do you want? And you can almost hear the plaintive voice saying, teacher, I want to see. I want to see. That, please, that this is everything to me. I want to see. And in this man's case, again, we can put it almost, when we read the words, we need to be the character and say, how precious is our sight to us, that if it was taken away from us and we had this opportunity, how would we ask that question? And you can almost hear this plaintive, he's a beggar. He knows how to beg. good teacher, I want to, let me see again. You almost hear him saying, please, please. And so Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well.
I think that I guess what's coming to my mind is this is a common thread through a lot of the healing miracles.
What's this you're talking about?
I'm talking about the basically the instantaneous belief coming from a person who is marginalized, and it they follow a pattern that, when you have the when he heals the blind, not the blind, the woman at the well of her hemorrhaging, it's touch his cloak, and that's and the centurion who heals his servant or his daughter.
Well, he also heals the servant, and then Jairus, the synagogue official,
his daughter. Yeah. So you hear that common pattern of healing someone who is at the margins or below, and uplifting them, and it's it's a sudden, quick faith.
I'm not so sure the faith is sudden.
Well, yeah, the faith, or it's a sudden, quick request. Faith,
Is it? Or is it the fact that what is Jesus actually doing in those cases? It's a good thought, Kathy. What is Jesus actually doing in those cases? He's pointing out to them that it's not anything special about him.
It's about you.
It's about you.
About you.
It's about where are you putting your confidence, your trust.
Yeah.
And when we talk about faith, we're talking about confidence and trust in God.
That's just kind of, I guess in today's society or whatever, probably even back then, it's almost miraculous to be able to have that kind of faith.
It is miraculous. See, that's what Barclay teaches in this book. That's why one reason I brought it up. The miracle isn't so much the cure. The miracle is the healing that comes about, the wholeness, the restoration that comes about because of one's trust and confidence in God. So in one sense, you don't really need Jesus. You do need Jesus because he's the only one that seems to be able to point it out or see it, because it was always there. Bartimaeus heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, so he got up and he screamed, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then he was like, I don't care if you're pushing me aside. I want to do this. So there's this manifestation, the acting out of faith. And Jesus simply acknowledges that, almost like a judge in a hearing or a trial. All the judge really does is pronounce what is. In a jury trial, for example, what we call the court of first instance, in other words, when the prosecution is bringing someone up on charges or something, their task is to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So what the jury is actually doing from a technical point of view is they are acting as finders of fact. What they are saying by, yes, they're guilty or not guilty, is the facts as presented are true. Therefore, if they are true, you have violated the law. So, or when it's a bench trial of some sort, when a judge does that, that's all the judge is doing. Think about that for a moment and go back to the opening chapters of John. When Jesus, Jesus came into the world, God so loved the world that he sent his only son, so that the world could be saved. And following that, it says, I do not come to judge the world. But then he explains that the world is already judged, not because of anything God is doing or Jesus is doing, but it's what we are doing. And it's like the acknowledgement of what is. What are the facts? So that when people say the judge did this or the judge did that, well, they could, maybe he's not wise, or he's corrupt in the sense that he makes decisions not based truly on the facts, but on, prejudices and all that sort of thing. But really in the idea behind it, it is simply the pronouncement. What the judge does is pronounce. And the pronouncement then makes the set of facts effective. So when a judge pronounces judgment or a sentence, for example, that's when people's status changes. For example, in a criminal trial, when the judge pronounces the jury's verdict, all he's saying is the jury has found that these facts are true. And since these facts are true, you are guilty of the following crime. But then the judge's next task is to pronounce sentence. Now, whether that's mandated by the law or in certain cases, the jury determines the sentence, or the judge applies the sentence with a sense of equity, or applies the law with a sense of equity. What he's doing is simply pronouncing, and it's the pronouncement. In other words, say you were free on bail and you're coming and going during the trial and all that kind of stuff. The minute the judge pronounces the jury verdict, you are guilty, you lose your freedom. And then later on at the sentencing, then what your future will be is determined. So if we think of that also as a modality when we're listening to Jesus' words here, what Jesus is saying, go, your faith has made you well. He's pronouncing the healing. He's not actually working the healing. So the power is coming from where?
From within.
From within. Yes. The power to heal Bartimaeus is coming from within, which means Bartimaeus has had it all the time. He just didn't know it. Which then says, oh, so do we need this? But at the same time, for example, in a trial, you need a judge. You need somebody who's actually going to do these things. So do we need Jesus? Yes, we do. But what his mission is to come to show the world that everything we need is already here. God gave it to us. God's grace has been with us from the beginning. There is no new dispensation of any sort. God, when God created the world, has put everything in the world that we needed. We just bollocksed it all up. And we need to be instructed, which is why one of the most important titles given to Jesus in these passages is the one that Bartimaeus uses. My teacher, let me see again. Teach me where my sight comes from.
That's really pretty profound.
Yeah.
When you read that word, I thought it seemed kind of odd. He didn't say my savior or my king or my teacher.
And again, this goes back to the rabbinic tradition of Judaism, where, for example, the way a synagogue is organized. The rabbi is the principal teacher and is the most important person because they're the teacher. The person who has the legal authority in a synagogue is the synagogue president, the member chosen to be the authority for the community. but the power comes from the teacher, because without the teacher, the community is nothing. So the power is in the teaching. That's why, when you hear in another place, we've already heard this in the Gospel of Mark, where does he get all this? Such teaching, and with authority. He's not just mouthing the words of other teachers or, the Talmud or something. He's teaching it exousia, out of his very being. And so in a very real way, Jesus is not only teaching us from his very being, he's saying that everything we need to be what God intends us to be is in our very being. We just need to get all the distractions away from it. And how do we do that? By following him, following the path that he has laid out before us. Notice what is said here when this passage concludes. Immediately, he regained his sight. There, George, see, again, he had been a seeing person before. He regained his sight. And what did he do? He didn't just go back to work. He followed him on the way. He followed him on the way. He became a disciple. Because now he understands where this is coming from. Now, the thing I wanted to circle back to a little bit for I said put a pin in it. Jesus' own disciples don't get this. They're following him because, oh, he's a good guy or whatever, or he called me and but this is something in the Gospel of Mark, theologians have called this sort of through line through the Gospel of Mark, the messianic secret. Two sides to that. First of all, Jesus is constantly telling people, don't tell anybody. Because, and some would theorize that the reason he's saying this is because they're going to misunderstand what it's all about, begin with. Secondly, the disciples don't get it either. And so this becomes a teaching tool of the evangelist Mark for us, because we don't get it all either. And so, because the disciples are sort of these bumbling followers, as we bumble along, we realize that eventually it will come. We may not, some do, but we may not have the dramatic insight as Bartimaeus did, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So we have to have confidence. And so what do? We keep following, we keep walking the path, keep walking the way. What are your thoughts?
Well, having been a choir member most of my life, there's always a hymn that says as well, and teach me, Lord, teach me of your righteousness.
Yeah. Now, there's a reason, while a lot of people say, oh, I'm so tired of these old hymns and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, the problem is that a lot of them in our hymnal were written in Victorian era, so they have that sort of almost overly flowery flavor to them, romanticism to them. But there are profound insights in the verses, in the words. We were joking the other day about music and how, one characteristic, I was talking to some folks who were not lifelong Episcopalians. They came from other traditions and so on. And, how the one thing that they just, have gotten used to now, but was hard for them, is that we sing every verse of every hymn. But because we believe very strongly that most hymns are, if they're in our hymnal, they've passed muster in terms of our theology and our self-understanding about God and about our relationship to God and about ourselves. And so get the whole story, you have to read the whole hymn. The hymn, and that's a lot of people, this is a technical thing, George, and Kathy, you're both in the choir, but it has to be pointed out to people. Hymns are not the music. Hymns are the verses. The music are tunes. So when you, for example, we say in the Mass, when we do the preface and before the Eucharistic prayer, we say, angels and archangels and all the companies of heaven sing this hymn, and then we recite, holy, holy, holy. It doesn't need to be sung because the hymn itself is the verse. I took a course when I was in college. Our sophomore literature course was English literature. And, particularly I took a course in romantic literature, romantic period. And, you're reading things like Ode to a Grecian Urn. I mean, an ode is itself considered a song, a hymn, but it's poetry. It's, and you read it out of a book because they're long. But at one point in culture, they would have been sung by bards and others, who had some literacy. So it's a very ancient form, but hymns themselves is the poetry. It's not the music that we hear with our ears. Those are tunes. That's why you can have the same hymn sung to several different tunes, depending on the meter of the tune. So,
But the music we enjoy was not universal, and there seemed to be something special about how it got preserved during the Dark Ages, and that probably the monks with their chants became incredible musicians. And I believe they had to learn how to write music so that it could be repeated.
Well, the earliest medieval chants are called Gregorian chants because it was Pope Gregory the Great who, as a Benedictine himself, actually came up with a system of notation so that there would be consistency and you could pass it from generation to generation, not only with memorization, but by actually seeing something on the page.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks a lot different than the music today looks.
Oh, for sure. And I had to learn that. I mean, yeah, I can look at Gregorian chant. I'm a little rusty at it, but I can, and you see it in our hymnal using modern notation, but
yeah,
you'll see it without any time signature and without any note stems. They're just dots on the staff to tell you where the tones go.
Yeah, one time it's something that looks kind of like an X.
Yeah. Well, actually, they're little boxes and
boxes. Okay, yeah.
All kinds of little different symbols that eventually grew into the modern notation system of the little round dots and with stems and all that. That grew up in the Renaissance era, but but it came from that. So you'll hear a lot of the late medieval English music, like Bird and so on. They will have a combination of chant, of Gregorian chant, and then polyphony that follows. So very interesting. The history of music is fascinating. Church music, particularly, is very fascinating that way. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, we have, verses in Mark are very short, and we have 6 of them here. And look at the richness in these 6 verses. One story.
Mark was in a hurry. He was concise. It was, the Joe Friday.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say that's my take on it always. I say just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah, and everything he says is immediately.
Right. There's an urgency to it.
Yeah, it's.
There's also but there's an economy to it. That is, when we first read it, we think, well, he didn't spend much time on this. It's not very long, but But there's an economy to his storytelling, just like this, 6 verses, and look all of everything we plumbed out of it, and there's probably more if we would think about it. But see, the problem with it for us as modern readers is there's a lot of cultural baggage that we don't have. I mean, from the point of view of good baggage, that there are a lot of terms of art and so on that the hearer of this gospel proclaimed to them in situ, in the situation, in the circumstance in which it was composed, would understand. They would intuit it, where we don't, because it's not our experience. For example, that whole thing about the anointed monarch, the title, the son of David, the title teacher, these kinds of things would have been sort of unspoken. And so there was no need to explain. And you notice that in the later gospels, the ones written later, you get a little bit of that, particularly in John. You get a term that means, he's explaining the sort of Hebrew terms because he's writing for Greek people. And they don't have the same cultural background or same experience. So the texts become important to understand. And also, this is a warning to those who would be mere textualists or literalists about the Bible, is that too often, if you just simply take the word as translated in the book that you have in front of you and say, this is what God said, you may not be accurate about that statement. The bumper sticker that I so eschew, God said it, I believe it, that ends it. Well, what did God say? It takes a while. You just don't read it off the page. And here we have, for example, our own life experience that goes into it. Kathy, you were saying something earlier about, being sort of a scientist and so on. George, you're in your medical practice, prior the idea of anointing a wound, these kinds of things. My experience of having my hands anointed as a priest, that when the king or the queen is anointed, it's the same thing. So they are turned in that moment. They are turned into priests. Again, go to the series, The Queen, and Queen Elizabeth's coronation was the first that was televised live. And there's a scene where the Duke of Windsor has his little coronation party there in Paris. And he's got some of his American friends and things there. And they're totally clueless to all this ritual. And he's explaining it. And of course, this was supposed to be him. And so he gets very nostalgic all of a sudden, and he's saying, she entered a little girl. She has now become a goddess, because the anointing. And when they bring the screen around the monarch, when the anointing happens, that's partly to shield because of this moment. It's to hide it from the people. Because you go in as one thing, you come out as another. What does that sound like for us also? Baptism. You go in as one thing, you come out as a child of God. And that in that same ceremony, what happens? You are marked out as Christ's own. With what? Chrism.
Chrism.
You are a member. We don't do it in our rite, but I remember in the Roman rite when we did that, you are a member of a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people set apart. Those words are actually used in the ritual. And then, of course, it's redone again, not redone in the sense that the first one wasn't effective, but it is confirmed in the Roman rite when the bishop anoints using chrism at confirmation. We don't use chrism in the Episcopal Church, but in the Roman Catholic Church they do. I wish we'd restore that because that calls to mind that initial anointing. So there you go. Well, it's past our time.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I will be in Rome next Thursday. So I'll leave this in your tender hands. You seem to be doing a good job without me.
I don't know if I can record it again. Who kn-
Well,
right now, I'm now getting something that's called Zoom Workplace.
yeah, because it's an upgrade. 'Cause if
Yeah,
you're logging in on with my credentials. That's the level that we have at.
yeah, but I don't have any place to record. I've looked for it.
Well, let me look at something because we do this at the Stevenson School. Let me stop the recording now because this is technical stuff.